Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the Literacy Leader Session. I'm excited to talk to you today about literacy. Literacy has been a longtime passion of mine, and I'm just honored to have a few minutes to talk with you about literacy and what you can do to transform your school and spark the same passion of literacy in your students. So without further delay, I want to start with a story about grandma's house behind the door. So I'm sure many of you have seen these encyclopedias way back in the day, as we say, or you actually have them as students or as young children, or you may have them at your grandparents' house. And I can remember going to my grandparents' house, seeing grandma, and I would go there just to see her and spend time with grandma. And in a room tucked away that nobody really ever went into was a set of encyclopedias. And I would go through these encyclopedias and I would take time to look through all of them and look at the pictures and look at the words. And at some point, early on, I couldn't read the words, but I would look at the pictures in the encyclopedia. And as I got older, I would read the words. The teacher would teach a concept at school, and I would be so excited. And I would go back into the encyclopedia and I would go through and look at the concepts or follow up on what the teacher talked about by looking through the encyclopedia. So these encyclopedias were very powerful for me as a young boy and very exciting to explore. And eventually, I would go through these encyclopedias, and it was particularly one particular spot that I would always get to when I would go to grandma's house. I'd go in there, I'd get behind the door, and I'd sit down behind the door, and I'd flip through the same pictures and read the same text all of the time. And it really was because when I would go to school, my friends had something that I didn't have. And so the best way for me to access it was to use these encyclopedias to kind of go through and to talk through, to read through, and sort of imagine what they had, that I could have it as well. And so these encyclopedias were very powerful for me growing up. And I was just so excited to come home from school when after the teacher would teach, and to just kind of look through and thumb through and see what I could find and see what I could learn in these encyclopedias. So I want to take a moment and I want to talk to you and just kind of walk you through my journey as to what sparked my passion or my love for literacy. What happened? Where did it come from? And so I'm going to walk you through going through elementary school all the way to college. What happened, how this happened. And so I'm going to highlight a few people on the journey. And the first person that I want to highlight is my second grade teacher, Ms. Loretta Robinson. Oh my goodness, Miss Robinson was a fantastic second grade teacher. She was just a very kind person. She made sure that we were learning. And one of the things that I remember about Ms. Loretta Robinson was every day she would read a book to us. And now in my 40s, I remember this book, which is one of my favorite of all time, is James and the Giant Peach. Miss Robinson would get up after snack or after we came in from recess, and she dimmed the lights in the classroom and she said, boys and girls, put your heads down. We're going to do our read aloud for today. And I'm going to read to you James and the Giant Peach. And I can remember Miss Robinson sitting on that stool at the front of the room with our heads down, and she would read to us James and the Giant Peach. And she would talk about Aunt Spiker, read about Aunt Sponge. She'd talk about James and the worms that he would find on his journey, and the man that had that bag of green worms. And I can remember to this day Miss Robinson reading to us James and the Giant Peach, I can remember hearing the inflection in her voice as she read. I could hear the excitement about reading as she read this story to us. And even in my age now, I just can still remember the freshness of Miss Robinson reading James and the Giant Peach to us. It was an amazing book. I still have a copy of James and the Giant Peach to this day. I still keep a copy of that book, and every now and then I'll thumb through it. And every time I read it, I think about Miss Robinson, which also led to watching the movie. I wanted to watch the movie because I read the book. And so I am a fan of reading the book first and then watching the movie. And I learned that even in second grade, later after the movie came out, the only reason I had interest in watching the movie was because Miss Robinson had read us the book, which was so powerful. Then after second grade, I can remember fourth grade. I can remember one of my favorite teachers of all times, Miss Deborah Harwell Braun. And I can remember Miss Harwell Braun reading to us every day. She would break out a book, and this particular book is Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Miss Harwell Braun was one of the most amazing teachers. She had energy when she taught. She had excitement in her voice when she taught. She was very caring and loving, but yet she was firm. She was firm, she was fair, and she was consistent. And I remember Miss Harwell Braun coming into the classroom and reading to us this book, Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sacker. And I remember a number of the characters. I remember Louis the yard keeper. I remember the teacher, Miss Jules. Miss Jules would wiggle her left ear, then her right ear, and then she turned kids into apples. I remember Joe, who couldn't count. Joe couldn't count. I remember Mauricia, who fell out of the window because she was sleeping in class. Just the weirdest stories. And they were very strange and odd stories. I can also remember the inflection in Mrs. Harwell Braun's voice when she would read this story to us. In fact, this book was so good. I can remember going to the library. I don't know if you all remember, but back in the day, as they used to say, we didn't have free media. You would go to the media center one day every other week, so every 2 weeks. So your class may have media on Tuesdays at 9 o'clock. So every other Tuesday at 9 o'clock, you would go to the media center and you could check out 2 books. And once you check out those 2 books, you would not go back to the media center unless you had read it. But you'd go back 2 weeks and you check out 2 more books. And I can remember Miss Harwell Braun reading this book to us. And when she finished it, I said, I have to have that book. That book is one of my favorites. I just have to have this particular book because it was so good. And she was just so amazing at reading this book. The characters stood out in my mind. It was funny, it was engaging, and it was a very exciting read to get me motivated to read. I also remember 5th grade. I remember 5th grade with Miss Patricia Timberlake, my 5th grade teacher. She read to us the book, My Brother Sam is Dead. This book was so powerful. I don't know why, but for some reason, I was able to connect with this book. I didn't have a family member or a brother that had passed away at the time or anything. And it was just one of my all-time favorite books to read. I can remember Miss Timberlake in class reading this book to us. And it was just so powerful for her to read this book to us and talked about Sam's family and talked about what Sam was going through and what Sam was having to endure during wartime. I believe it's during the Civil War, if I can remember. And it was just a powerful read, full of emotions, talked about family connections. It just had a lot of meaning and value to me as a 5th grader, just powerful book. I remember Miss Timberlake at the front of the room with the lights dim, reading this book to us. We were grabbing every word that she said about this book, and it was just amazing. And then we get to high school. High school was just a great place. It was fun and it was exciting. But I remember Mr. Lee Bass. He was my 9th grade English teacher, and he read to us the book Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. It was just an amazing short story, if I can recall, from high school. It was just a great story. And he would read to us part of it. We would read part of it. And it was just one of the best books of all times that Mr. Bass could have ever read to us. Mr. Bass, I can remember the inflection in his voice of when he would read this to us. When Pip met the convict, and he had a click in his voice. I can remember Mr. Bass imitating that click in his voice. I can remember, I believe her name was Miss Havisham, who wore the wedding dress. And I can still remember and see Mr. Bass in this picture in the front of the class. I can picture in my mind him reading this book to us. So I have a number of experiences from kindergarten all the way to 9th grade. I can remember my teachers showing and demonstrating their own love and passion for reading, which spilled over to me. It gave me my own personal love and passion and enjoyment about reading. You know, I was one of those students who really didn't like to read a lot, but things happened and things changed. And I know in adulthood that I can contribute a lot of what changed by thinking and reflecting on these phenomenal teachers that I just share with you, and their passion and their love and their desire of literacy, and giving us the tools that we needed to be successful readers and to understand what literacy is. So I'm so thankful for these teachers sharing their passion and their love and excitement for literacy and reading. But here's where things really started to change for me as a reader. In the year 2000, I was a sophomore in college at East Carolina University. And in college at ECU, of course, you had to major in something. And so my major was elementary education. It was what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a teacher. At first, I wanted to be a math teacher, but I decided that I would do elementary education. And then you had to have a minor. And my minor was in child development and family relations. And I was taking a course in child development and family relations. And this book was one of the required readings, A Child Called It. And as you can see, it says an extraordinary, inspirational story. It was a national bestseller, international bestseller, and a New York bestseller. And it truly is about a child who went through trauma and pretty much did all he could to survive. Dave Pelzer is the author. And this book was admittedly the first book in college that I read front to back. It was so meaningful and so powerful that I could not put it down. It was one of those books that you just could not stop reading. And I just can't explain how powerful it was to me at the time. Now, I couldn't make a connection with what Dave Pelzer was going through, but I was intrigued by his resiliency. I was intrigued by how he approached the problem or approached navigating the problem. I was just intrigued by it. And it was here that I realized that it was something about Dave's story that interested me. It was something about Dave's story that engaged me and that excited me, that I wanted to hear more. I wanted to hear other people's stories. I wanted to become familiar with other people's stories. I often love to share my story. And so the exciting piece was that I wanted to hear about someone else's story. And the opportunity to hear about someone else's story happened for me in this sophomore child development and family relations course. And there it triggered in me my excitement about autobiographies and biographies, hearing other people's stories. So for a long time, I thought, well, maybe I don't like to read. But it really wasn't that I didn't like to read. It was I hadn't found or explored in the K-12 experience much of nonfiction. I didn't have that exposure to determine whether or not I liked fiction versus nonfiction, or whether or not I really enjoyed reading an autobiography or biographies, or historical documents, exploring historical documents. The exposure was not there. So in college, it was so exciting to finally find something that I was interested in, that interested me, and that I could make a personal connection to. It was very powerful for me. So in that same line, there are 6 things that I know for sure. There's 6 things that I know for sure that I want to share with you. And we're going to go through these 6 things, and we're going to talk a little bit about each of them. And the first one is, it's critical for children to have access to print and digital text. It is so important and critical for children to have access to print and digital text. A quiet space for children to explore text is so important. The power of a read aloud should not be underestimated. Exposure to various genres helps students identify what they want to read. And emphasis should be placed on the connection between reading and writing. And the last thing that I know for sure is that after learning to read, students should have access to literacy across all content areas, particularly science and social studies. These are the 6 things that I know for sure. So let's talk about number 1. Number 1, it is critical for children to have access to print and digital text. So let's talk about that for a moment. During this past year, we learned so much with the pandemic. We learned that virtual learning was not the easiest way to learn for a number of our students. It doesn't mean that the model doesn't work, but it just simply means that it was not a best fit for a number of our students. And that's okay. So how do we parallel that to this? We know that it is a lot easier for us, even as adults, to read, understand printed text. We're able to take a highlighter and highlight the text. We're able to jot notes in the margin of the text, which is what we've been taught and how we've been trained. We're able to underline key ideas and key concepts in the text. We're able to do those things. And what we find is that a lot of students are not able to translate that to other ways. They're not able to translate that to digital text, or they struggle to translate it in the way of reading digital text. Digital text is harder to underline, to mark for key ideas, etc. Those things are a bit more challenging for digital text. So that's why it's important for students to have access to printed text as well as digital text, so that they're able to translate that, particularly at the beginning of the school year, and at the beginning of the school year, having that understanding of how to navigate digital text. And then when they get to the end of the school year and they're being assessed on state assessments, they know how to navigate digital text. So it's very important that children have access to printed text and digital text. With my example about the encyclopedia, Obviously, years ago, I wasn't fortunate enough to have access to digital text, and there really wasn't a lot of digital text around at the time as we have now, and as easy it is to access. But we want to make sure that students are able to access both printed and digital text. So what else do I know for sure? I know for sure, based on what Miss Robinson did, what Miss Timberlake did, what Mrs. Harwood Braun did, that a quiet space for children to explore text is important. Allowing students to be able to concentrate and to read what they know is so key for them. One of the things that students will do now is sometimes students can have earbuds. They are able to focus and pay attention by listening to music. That's not my method. That doesn't work for me. I need that quiet space that I can go to and drift off to and engage in text, engage in understanding and reading and exploring the text. That works best for me. And you may find what works for you. So you need to maybe find out and think about what works for students. Most of our students, the majority of our students, they're not able to concentrate with a lot of noise when it comes to reading and understanding or decoding text. They need that quiet space. They need time to be in a space where they can concentrate, they can get to know the key concepts and ideas, and even ask themselves questions to expand their knowledge on what they're reading. So this one is extremely important for our students, and creating spaces in our classrooms that's conducive to reading and wanting to learn. Creating those fun spaces in our classrooms for our students to explore text is so important for them. What else do I know for sure? I know for sure that read alouds are powerful, that we shouldn't underestimate the power of a read aloud. As I shared with you in my examples, I had great teachers who read to us every single day. Because of their read alouds, I learned inflection. I learned how to project my voice. I learned how to emphasize certain places in the text. I learned how to think about what the character was thinking, or how the character was trying to convey a thought, or how the writer was trying to convey a thought or an idea. Read alouds allows, especially in our younger grades, it builds fluency. It builds fluency for our younger students to understand and to know how to read text and how to fluently, more so, how to fluently read text. So we don't want to underestimate the power of a read aloud. So often in our classes today, we don't do a lot of read alouds anymore. We don't, allow our students to sit in spaces and hear text read to them in a way that is meaningful and that is powerful for them. We've got to get back to allowing our students to do that. We've got to get back to allowing our teachers to do that for our students, because it ultimately helps them. It ultimately helps them grow and become better readers and more fluent readers. What else do I know for sure? I know that exposure to various genres helps students identify what they want to read. I go back to that K-12 experience. While I had outstanding and amazing teachers, one of the challenges that I share with you was the fact that I didn't get exposure to a lot of text. Much of it in elementary school was nonfiction. And maybe we would do a poem or, a genre, different genres, in some way. But I didn't have a whole lot of exposure to determine what I liked. Sometimes, students want to read about cars. Sometimes students want to read books dealing with mechanics. Sometimes students want to read about hair. There are a number of books and different types of text that we want our students to be exposed to. So you want to make sure that you have different genres that students can read and that students can access. Historical documents, those things are very important, because students are then able to take a moment after being exposed to all of these things and say, this is what I like. This is what I enjoy. This is what I really, really, truly like to read. So this is so important. What else do I know for sure? I know for sure that an emphasis must be placed on the connection between reading and writing. These two things are so connected, and there have been times when it comes to reading and writing, they're introduced as two separate things. To some degree they are, but they also coincide and they work together. And the question that I often ask principals when I go into schools is this: how do you know children are learning? Well, they either are writing about it or they're talking about it. That's the way that we can measure if kids are learning. They're either writing about it or they're talking about it, because those are one way that you can see it happening, and you can hear it happening, and you can get judged for yourself as to what quality of learning is taking place, or if learning is taking place at all. So I think it is so important that we think about every day, even across other content areas, that students are consistently reading and that they're writing, and that writing is incorporated into daily instruction for our students. And what else do I know for sure? I know that after learning to read, children should have access to literacy across all of the content areas, particularly science and social studies. This one is huge. This particular thing that I know for sure is so critical. One thing that we do often is students are challenged in reading, or they're told to read more, but they really, and particularly in K2, don't have as much access and exposure to science and social studies, literacy in science and social studies. And that's something, as school leaders and principals, that you have to ask yourself. Yes, it is often embedded in K2 in the reading and math is in the science and social studies is embedded in the reading, but are they really getting good exposure to content? One of my favorite things to do when I was a principal that was so effective, particularly for the upper grades, was I would take my best English teacher, for example, my best sixth grade English teacher. I would find my best social studies teacher and science teachers who would intentionally incorporate ELA strategies in their science and social studies teaching. I would intentionally group those teachers together, and then I would take the students who traditionally did not do well, and I would put those students in those classes. And what I found after doing that was the data went through the roof in terms of their outcomes, their student outcomes. It was amazing when you took a teacher who had a passion for literacy and reading instruction, a great ELA teacher, and you pair them with someone who says, all right, during PLC, I want to share my best practices with social studies and science teachers, and those teachers accept that and they gravitate towards it. it is an amazing thing to see them share those practices and what outcomes happen for students in the area of literacy. So you may want to think about that. Who are your strongest, if you are a teacher who teaches 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, or principal who is at a middle school or a K school, who are your strongest teachers? Who are your great teachers who embrace those ELA concepts in social studies and in science? How can you create a schedule to ensure that those teachers are paired together and they're accessing text that's rich for their content area and using those ELA strategies for those students who need it most? I even also challenge you, if you are a principal at a K-5 school, how can you do this in K-5? How can you pair your teachers together to share best practices? How can you organize it that way across your school? So that's something for you to think about. And it's something I feel confident that I know for sure and have seen the results of doing this. So as a principal, I want to share that there are 3 musts that I want to talk about for the next few minutes with you as principals. There are 3 musts that you definitely have to think about. And one is that you need to ensure that you know and understand you and your staff's beliefs about reading. You got to ensure that you know and understand you and your staff's beliefs about reading. When I was a principal, one of the challenges that we had was a number of students who were English language learners who did not have a full grasp, obviously, of the English language. But we also had teachers who were very opinionated about their strength and belief and effectiveness of whole language approach to teaching literacy. And then we had another group of teachers in the building who were very firm in their understanding and their belief about the effectiveness of including phonics in reading instruction. And to some degree in the K2 arena, it started to cause a lot of challenges. And so to some degree, I'll say a rift in the staff when I first arrived there. And so what was important for me was to sort of resolve that rift, that, I can't change what you believe, but as a principal, I can change your practices. I can say, this is what I expect us to do as a staff. You can have this belief and subscribe to this belief, but when it comes to serving kids, this is what it has to look like and what we need to do. And so we just had the staff come together and talk about what we believed about reading and literacy and what were the practices that we needed to serve our students, whether they were English language learners, whether they were students who were not achieving to their potential. We had to organize around that thought and around that process to ensure that we were serving our children well, that our own personal beliefs about reading did not necessarily impact what we knew was right for kids. So as principals, you may want to take an inventory about what your teachers know and what you know about reading and literacy and the understanding they have and what they believe. The belief part is the piece that you definitely have to explore. The other must as a principal is that you've got to ensure that you have a school schedule that gives teachers enough time to provide high quality reading instruction. I can't tell you the number of times that when teachers have created their schedule, the time they have not allotted to reading instruction. Based on some of the research that I've done, one of the expectations is that all schools must have 120 minutes of reading instruction. And that also incorporates writing. So it's not reading 120 minutes and writing 30 minutes. It's 120 minutes of solid, high quality reading and writing instruction. So you may want to, as principals, look at your schedule and determine if you are allotting enough time for high quality reading instruction to happen. And I'll also comment that it's not necessarily just about the time. It's about what is happening during that reading block. What are your expectations of what should happen during that reading block? One of the things that I expected was small group instruction. Guided reading instruction was to happen in, K-5. That students had access to good, rich text, that students were talking about reading. They were writing about what they were reading. And sort of we structured and designed the block, and we saw our data move in our school. What does your expectation for reading and writing instruction to look like in grades 6, 12? Do you still want them in reading groups? Do you want your teacher serving them in small reading groups? Do you want your teachers exposing them to various texts? What is it that you expect? So you may want to think about your school schedule, and have you created a schedule that will allow teachers to maximize their time teaching reading and writing instruction. And then the third one, this one is powerful. As a school leader, it's important for you to build your own understanding and knowledge of reading instruction. There's a change in reading. We're transitioning to the science of reading. And the science of reading really goes back to the foundational things that many of us watching this recording learned when we were younger. The science of reading just kind of goes back and approaches literacy more from a lens of phonics. What is your understanding of the science of reading? I think that's so critical for school leaders and principals and district staff to explore and to be on top of the science of reading and knowing what reading is. Going back and knowing what those practices are. What are the practices that we're currently doing in public education when it comes to reading that we probably should abandon? What are those practices that we probably should not be doing anymore, that we have been doing for years, but we know they don't yield high results for our students? You may want to even meet with your teachers and say, based on the science of reading, these are some practices that we've been doing school-wide, or have them list some practices school-wide and then go through and say, this isn't research-based. This is not helpful for kids. And to truly have some good introspection for yourself and for your school. So you've got to build your own understanding, and you've got to build your own knowledge about reading instruction. So if you are a high school principal and you may be transitioning to elementary, or you're a middle school principal and you're transitioning to elementary, or if you're an elementary principal and you're transitioning to middle and high school, how does it fit? What do you know? What is your expectation for your assistant principals to develop their knowledge? What does it look like? And I guess that's what I'm trying to get to, is what does it look like, and what have you articulated in terms of your expectations? The only way you can do that is to get familiar and for you to know and to understand what reading instruction is, especially now. So behind the door at grandma's house, now that I've told you about what I am sure that we've got to do, I figured it out at grandma's house behind the door. What captivated me, what held my attention, what I was so excited about and, so engrossed about behind that door. It all worked for me. And I went through, and every time I was behind that door, I told you I was looking at something. And the something was the letter D for dog. I was looking at the letter D because all of my friends had a dog and I wasn't allowed to have a dog at home, and I couldn't have a dog. But having access to these encyclopedias, having access to text allowed me to have me a dog in my own mind, to think about when I got older someday, that I would have me a dog, and that I was going to have a beautiful little Cocker Spaniel dog that was my doggie, and that would be home with me, and that it would be at my house. And that's what I did every day. I would go behind that door at grandma's house, and I would dream, and I would envision, and I would imagine having a dog. And I would go through that encyclopedia and look at every breed of dog that there was on earth. And I used to could tell you every breed of dog. And even now I pretty much can figure it out. If I take time to think about it, I know the breed just by looking at it. And, we've got all kinds of dogs now, like cockapoodles and that sort of thing. But I would sit behind that door and I would figure out what kind of dog and what they looked like and what their temperament was, and what they could eat, and if they were more friendly with kids or if they weren't friendly with kids. I was able to do that. And so I'm thankful for her having those encyclopedias behind that door, because that encyclopedia opened up a world for me. But I figured out a couple of other things. Let me show you what else I figured out, right? So I figured out that obviously, though I couldn't have that dog at home, having access to text allowed me to imagine having one. It permitted me to think about, and pardon that typo there, ALLOWED, allowed me to have that dog with me. And so I was really excited that even though I couldn't have one at home, literacy and text and books allowed me to have one. That also, my love for nonfiction was developed. Oh my goodness, it all finally hit me and came together that, sitting behind that door after school, that's why I developed my love for nonfiction, because I had early exposure to that. Even though during school, I really didn't have that exposure, but it triggered in college why I really like nonfiction, was because I was exposed more to it. So yes, I did love, those funny little stories in fourth grade and in second grade, James and the Giant Peach, and sideways stories from Wayside School. I absolutely loved those stories. But what I connected with most was my love for nonfiction text. Tell me about your family. Tell me about who you are. And if I'm able to make that connection with you, that was the thing that excited me the most. And the power, as I said, of another person's story impacted me and made me fall in love with autobiographies. Make sure you give your students the opportunity to discover what they love. Expose them to all of it. Expose them to teachers who read text aloud to them. Expose them to teachers who have a passion for literacy, that know great instructional strategies, that's strong in their craft, that know their craft. Make sure you give that to your students. That's the piece that is so critical and so powerful for our students. And if you do those things, you will make sure that the playing field is leveled for them, and you will make sure that they have the ability to explore and to do the things in life that they've always wanted to do. Literacy is powerful. It's the tool to success. It's the key to all of us being successful and being educated. And we want to make sure that we give our students the same opportunity. Thank you so much for allowing me to spark the magic and talk about how the magic was sparked in my life and create a passion for literacy. Here is my contact information. If I can be of service to you in the future, I am happy to do so. And I hope you enjoyed our time together, talking about what you can do as a literacy leader in our schools. Thank you.